Hello and welcome back. Netflix just released Spiderhead, which means it's time to break down the film. This video explains the Spiderhead ending and general plot of the movie. There will be spoilers for Spiderhead. If you do not wish to be spoiled, this is your warning. If you have any questions about the film, or you're looking for any kind of additional explanation beyond what's in the video, leave a comment below and we'll respond as best we can. There are chapter timestamps, so you can jump straight to the ending explanation if you'd like. Spiderhead is based on the short story Escape from Spiderhead, written by George Saunders. However, the writers of the film had to expand on Saunders' original short story in order to give it a more cinematic take. There are some big differences between the short story and the film, but the main premise is largely the same. We'll get into some of the main differences toward the end of the video. Spiderhead takes place in the near future in a prison that doubles as a research facility. The name Spiderhead comes from the visual appearance of the building, which looks somewhat like a spider's head sticking out of the cliff where it resides. The facility is run by Steve Abnesti, who owns a pharmaceutical company that is working on a variety of drugs that alter human behavior. While there are a wide variety of drugs, the main ones used in the film are given a designation based on a bingo card. Once all the drugs are perfected, it will be bingo, and Steve will sell to the highest bidder and be rich beyond his wildest dreams, while also having a huge impact on the world. The various drugs include G47, which makes you laugh at everything and generally feel great. N40, called Luvocatin, with love in the spelling of the name, which forces you to see beauty in everything. B15, also called Verbulence, expands your vocabulary and allows you to express yourself much more fluently with words. I16, also known as Darkenflox, which causes you to feel negatively about everything, hating yourself and life in general. I27, which makes you fear something, and B6, known as OBDX, which is a general obedience drug. The drugs are administered through a device attached to the inmate's lower back, likely feeding the fluids directly into the spinal cord. Many other injections are made in various parts of the spine because it's a quick and direct way to influence the body, generally to provide pain relief of some sort, but in this case, to administer the various behavioral drugs. The more potent the application, the stronger the effect. For instance, a small dose of N40 makes the subject find something very alluring or generally attractive. A large dose, however, will make them want nothing more than to be completely immersed in the person or object. It's the difference between simply finding someone attractive and having an uncontrollable desire to have sex with them. Like almost any drug, there's a high when you first use it, but then there's a low as well. For instance, with Verbulence, you have trouble finding the words you want to use and articulating yourself as you're coming down off the drug. All of the inmates at Spiderhead have committed crimes that would normally give them a lengthy prison sentence. By volunteering for the Spiderhead research facility, they live a much better life compared to a typical prison inmate, with better living quarters, great food, and a relatively peaceful environment. The main inmate is Jeff, who killed his friend and his girlfriend while drinking and driving. He was thrown from the car and probably should have had significant injuries, but was somehow able to stand up almost immediately, run back to the car, and pull out his dead friend just before the car blew up with his girlfriend inside, also not inflicting any kind of significant damage to Jeff. Putting the lack of injuries aside, Jeff blames himself for both of their deaths and still calls his girlfriend's phone to hear her voice and leave a message, even though he's called so many times her voicemail is now full. This is partially a punishment and partially a relief for him. Hearing her voice reminds Jeff of the terrible incident that he is solely to blame for, something he has trouble letting go of, while it also offers him a small bit of solace to hear his dead girlfriend's voice again. Lizzie is Jeff's new love interest, but he's hesitant to move forward with the relationship despite their clear attraction to one another. This is because he feels as though he doesn't deserve to be happy with someone after what he's done. Lizzie is in prison because she left her 9-month-old baby in a hot car for 3 hours in the summer while she worked a shift at Walmart. The child died, and now Lizzie has to live with that pain for the rest of her life. Rogan killed his girlfriend for cheating on him, and Ray went to rehab multiple times before killing his drug dealer and 2 others. The other 2 inmates of significance are Sarah, who is one of the oldest inmates and has some sort of mental illness that causes her to act out in a variety of ways, including wiping her own feces on the walls of the facility, earning her the name Shitfinger. There's also Heather, who doesn't seem to have a care in the world and tends to get by on her looks. We don't know details of what these 2 did to get thrown in prison, but suffice to say it was pretty bad. While the inmates all agreed to assist with the research, they still have to agree to each dose of the drug as they're administered. This is a legal requirement since the drugs are experimental and being tested on humans, presumably after the animal testing phase. But given how Steve speaks to his assistant Mark, they likely skipped a few steps in their haste to get the product perfected and sold. Nevertheless, before administering any drugs, the inmates must state that they acknowledge the receipt of said drugs. Throughout the film, we're made to believe that Steve is testing all of these drugs in order to perfect them. He will make 2 inmates take N40 and have sex with the same person at different times, then have that person decide which of the 2 inmates should be administered Darkenfloxx. We're meant to believe that this is a test of true love to determine how well N40 works, if there are any residual effects after the initial dosage, and if the partner will choose one inmate over the other to get the terrible drug due to his feelings for them. In reality, all of the drugs are already perfected with the exception of 2, one of which is B6, known as OBDX or Obedience, also obedience. This is the only drug that actually matters as far as Steve is concerned. If you can make someone do as they're told, no matter what that is, Steve believes the world will be a better place. There won't be any wars or even disagreements because everyone will lose free will and be forced to obey. Never mind the fact that someone has to make a decision on who gives the orders, and that alone could start a war. We've even seen similar scenarios in other sci-fi films such as Equilibrium, which saw society taking pills to remain relatively docile, feeling nothing, until a group of people stopped taking pills and overthrew the government. Very underrated movie if you've never seen it. While Steve's grand idea is conceptually flawed, the end of the film showcases the flaw firsthand. When the drug administration device malfunctions and administers too much Darkenfloxx, Heather commits suicide to stop the pain and negative thoughts. Steve drops his keys in a rush to get to Heather, which gives Jeff time to look through Steve's notes and figure out that Steve had been lying to him, saying he needed to check with his boss and a committee about administering Darkenfloxx, when in reality it was always Steve's decision to make. Jeff later questions Mark about why he's helping Steve with such morally gray research. This is when Jeff learns that B6 is the only drug that matters to Steve, despite Mark offering money-making ideas for some of the other drugs. Steve doesn't care because he's short-sighted and only in it for the big bucks and total control which a perfected B6 would offer. Jeff convinces an already hesitant Mark to take evidence of the wrongdoings at Spiderhead to the authorities, which he does the next morning. When Jeff refuses to administer Darkenfloxx to Heather or Sarah after sleeping with both of them, Steve discovers that Jeff is actually in love with Lizzie. Steve then attempts to force Jeff into giving Lizzie Darkenfloxx, but thanks to some help from Mark, Jeff is able to turn the tables on Steve, giving him Darkenfloxx instead of Lizzie and eventually undermining his control over the facility and escaping with Lizzie, despite Steve's attempt to send the other inmates after them for fear of having to go back to a normal prison, losing their relative life of luxury at Spiderhead. Taking a deeper dive into the ending, Lizzie knew the terrible effects of Darkenfloxx, but she told Jeff to give it to her because she felt like it was a punishment for the murder of her child. Similar to how Jeff continued to take drugs, both positive and negative, because he felt he deserved the punishment after what he did to his friend and girlfriend. Trauma can easily cause this kind of reaction, especially when it's trauma at a young age. Steve was abandoned by his father when he was only 8 years old, which is the main reason why he feels the need to go big or go home by perfecting B6. If he can do that and cure the world, not only would it stop any more fathers from abandoning their children, but it would also prove that he was worthy of living and having a good family. That what his father put him through was wrong, and he deserved a better childhood. B6 worked relatively well, which is why many of the other drugs also worked. B6 was the base drug, with everything else working in tandem with B6 to make people behave in a certain way. The only thing keeping B6 from perfection was true love. Jeff refused to administer Darkenfloxx to Lizzie because he loved her. At the same time, Steve refused to follow Jeff's orders after Jeff gave him B6 and told him to essentially shut down his research at Spiderhead. This is because Steve loved his research so much and this was all he had in life, so he was able to override the effects of B6. In short, if someone is passionate enough, B6 won't be effective. That is what Steve was trying to solve by having Jeff choose who would get Darkenfloxx. Steve knew Darkenfloxx was a terrible drug, but he kept using Jeff because he needed something that Jeff absolutely did not want to do in order to properly test the limits of B6. Steve ends up crashing his plane into a nearby mountain because the drug administration device gets damaged in the fight with Jeff, which causes N40 to be administered while he's flying the plane. To him, the mountain was so overwhelmingly beautiful that he was unable to comprehend the fact that he was about to crash into it. Shifting over to the differences between the short story and the film, the inmates get time shaved off their sentences in the short story. While it's never confirmed if this is the case in the movie, we do know that Lizzie had applied for a pardon and actually got it a week before the events at the end of the film. Jeff was also free to go 7 months ago, but Steve withheld that information and also made it impossible for the inmates to keep track of time, barely letting them out of the facility to even know what time of day it was. Steve wouldn't have had to go through all this trouble if the inmates actually had shortened sentences. Steve probably wouldn't have been able to pull all this off if the inmates were already getting shortened sentences just from helping out. There are also some name changes between the short story and the film. The equivalent of Sarah's character in the short story is called Rachel, Mark is Verlaine, and Steve Abnesti is known as Ray instead. Lizzie doesn't exist in the short story, somewhat replaced by Rachel, and Steve doesn't have as much power. In the short story, Steve, or Ray, has to get a warrant before he can administer Dark Influx against someone's will, something he would not have done in the film if the same situation occurred. Finally, Jeff dies in the short story. Instead of being forced to administer Dark Influx to Rachel, he uses it on himself and commits suicide while under the influence of the drug. Jeff then hears a voice that says his body is salvageable and he can come back to life, but he refuses, saying he's had enough of life, then dies happily knowing he'll never kill anyone again. It's a very different ending that focuses more on Jeff's emotions rather than the somewhat action-packed ending of the film that focused on Steve and Jeff almost equally. Let us know which ending you preferred and what you thought of the movie as a whole. If you have any theories of your own, leave them in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who loves dark science fiction films.